Welcome to the Ghastly Journal, where the darkest secrets that history tried to bury are brought to light. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into a tale designed to make your blood run cold. The story of the Caldwell family is what we'll uncover, a name that once commanded respect in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, but now whispers through the shadows of a legacy built on betrayal and bones. What the Caldwells built on, they never paid for, and as you'll soon discover, some debts can never be escaped, not even by death itself. Picture this. The year is 1847, and the morning mist clings to the Allegheny Mountains like ghostly fingers. In the small town of Millbrook, nestled between winding streams and ancient oak trees, something terrible is about to unfold. Proud on Prospect Hill stands the Caldwell Mansion. Its Gothic revival architecture casts long shadows across the valley below. But a secret so horrifying it would curse the family for generations to come lies beneath its foundation. Our story begins with Ezekiel Caldwell, a man whose ambition burned brighter than the fires of hell itself. Born in 1798 to a modest farming family, the simple life the Pennsylvania countryside offered never contented Ezekiel. While other young men were satisfied with raising livestock and tending crops, Ezekiel had his eyes set on something far grander. An empire is what he wanted to build, and he didn't care what the cost would be. By 1825, through questionable business dealings, Ezekiel had accumulated enough wealth to purchase a significant tract of land on the outskirts of Millbrook. The locals whispered about how a man of his humble origins could afford such an expensive piece of property. But their gossip was paid no mind by Ezekiel. He had bigger plans. Plans that would make the Caldwell name synonymous with prestige and power in the region. The land Ezekiel purchased was known locally as Whispering Ridge. A name that should have served as a warning. The Native American tribes who had lived in the area for centuries considered it sacred ground, a place where the spirits of their ancestors rested. The Lapi people, who had called this region home long before European settlers arrived, had specific burial grounds scattered throughout the area. These weren't just random graves. They were ceremonial sites where tribal leaders, shamans, and warriors had been laid to rest with great spiritual significance and reverence. But such superstitions were not something Ezekiel Caldwell believed in. To him, the land was nothing more than an investment opportunity, a blank canvas on which he would paint his vision of grandeur. The fact that it might be sacred to others was irrelevant. What mattered was its fertile soil, its strategic location, and its potential for development. Almost immediately after Ezekiel took possession of the land, the first signs of trouble appeared. Workers hired to clear the area for construction began reporting strange discoveries. Bones, pottery shards, and ceremonial objects were unearthed with disturbing regularity. Any reasonable person would have stopped the work and consulted with local tribal representatives. But Ezekiel was driven by an obsession that bordered on madness. Instead of acknowledging what he had found, a decision that would damn his family for generations was made by Ezekiel. He ordered his workers to continue clearing the land, but with specific instructions. Any bones or artifacts they discovered were to be quietly disposed of, buried deeper, or simply ground up and mixed with the mortar for the foundation of his future mansion. The workers, desperate for employment and intimidated by Ezekiel's increasingly erratic behavior, followed his orders without question. As the months passed, the desecration continued. Dozens of Native American graves were destroyed, their contents scattered or incorporated into the very structure of the Caldwell mansion. Almost immediately, the workers began to notice strange phenomena. Tools would disappear overnight, only to be found in impossible locations. The sound of drums could be heard echoing through the woods at night, even though no living Native Americans remained in the area. Some workers reported seeing shadowy figures watching them from the tree-line, figures that would vanish the moment they were looked at directly. But perhaps the most disturbing development was the change in Ezekiel himself. As the construction progressed, he became increasingly paranoid and violent. He would spend hours walking the construction site at night, muttering to himself in languages that no one recognized. His appearance began to deteriorate. His hair turned prematurely gray. Deep lines etched themselves into his face, and his eyes took on a wild, haunted look that frightened even his own family. In 1832, the mansion was completed, a towering testament to Ezekiel's ambition and callous disregard for the sacred. Built in the Gothic revival style that was popular among the wealthy elite of the time, it featured soaring spires, intricate stonework, and elaborate stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the floors during the day. But at night, those same windows seemed to glow with an otherworldly light, as if the very walls were alive with malevolent energy. With great fanfare, the Caldwell family moved into their new home. Initially delighted with their new status symbol was Ezekiel's wife Margaret. She hosted elaborate dinner parties and social gatherings, eager to establish the Caldwells as the premier family in the region. But the happiness was short-lived. Within weeks of moving in, strange things began to happen. On a cold October night in 1832, the first incident occurred. Margaret woke to the sound of crying coming from the nursery where their infant son Thomas slept. But when she entered the room, she found the baby sleeping peacefully. The crying continued, seeming to come from the walls themselves. Night after night, the phantom crying persisted, growing louder and more anguished with each passing day. Soon, other phenomena began to manifest. Doors would open and close on their own, always in the middle of the night. Footsteps could be heard pacing the halls, but when family members investigated, they found nothing but empty corridors. The temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly and inexplicably, leaving family members shivering even in the middle of summer. But the most terrifying experiences were the visions. Margaret began to see figures in traditional Native American dress standing in the corners of rooms, their faces painted with war paint, their eyes burning with rage. These apparitions never spoke, but their message was clear. The Caldwells were not welcome in this house, and they would pay for what they had done. Ezekiel, meanwhile, was experiencing his own form of torment. He began to have vivid nightmares in which he was pursued through dark forests by an endless procession of the dead. In these dreams, he could hear their voices, speaking in languages he didn't understand, but somehow knew were curses being laid upon him and his family. He would wake screaming, his body covered in scratches and bruises that had no earthly explanation. As the months turned to years, the supernatural activity in the Caldwell mansion intensified. Servants refused to work there, spreading stories throughout the town about the cursed house on Prospect Hill. The local pastor, Reverend Jonathan Whitmore, was called in to bless the house, but even he was unable to complete the ceremony. According to his own account written in his personal journal, he was physically forced from the house by an unseen presence that spoke to him in what he described as the voice of 1,000 angry spirits. The Caldwell children began to suffer as well. Thomas, now a toddler, would often be found talking to invisible companions, speaking in what sounded like Native American languages, despite never having been exposed to them. He would point to empty corners of rooms and say things like, "The sad men are crying," or, "They want to go home." Margaret's attempts to dismiss these incidents as childhood imagination became increasingly difficult as Thomas began to display knowledge of things he couldn't possibly know. The family's isolation from the community grew as stories of the haunted mansion spread. Business associates began to avoid Ezekiel and social invitations dried up. The Caldwells found themselves trapped in a house that was becoming more hostile with each passing day, surrounded by a community that viewed them with fear and suspicion. In 1835, tragedy struck the family directly. Margaret gave birth to a daughter, Sarah, but the child was born with severe deformities that the local doctor had never seen before. The baby's limbs were twisted, her eyes were clouded with cataracts, and she seemed to be in constant pain. Margaret was convinced that the house itself had corrupted her unborn child, and she began to plead with Ezekiel to sell the property and move the family somewhere else. But Ezekiel, now completely consumed by his obsession with the mansion, refused to consider leaving. He had invested too much both financially and emotionally to abandon his dream. Instead, he became convinced that the supernatural phenomena were actually signs of his own importance, proof that he had been chosen for some greater purpose. His grip on reality began to slip entirely. The breaking point came in the winter of 1836. A blizzard had trapped the family inside the mansion for several days, and the supernatural activity reached a crescendo. The sound of drums echoed through the house constantly, accompanied by chanting that seemed to come from the very foundations. The temperature dropped so low that ice began to form on the interior walls, and the family's breath was visible even when they huddled around the fireplace. On the third night of the storm, Margaret woke to find her husband standing at the foot of their bed, his eyes rolled back in his head, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. When she tried to wake him, he turned toward her with an expression of such rage and hatred that she screamed and fled the room. Thomas, now 4 years old, was found the next morning in the parlor, sitting in a circle of what appeared to be bone fragments, drawing pictures of people being buried alive. That was the night Margaret finally understood the true horror of what her husband had done. Creeping down to the basement in search of a rational explanation for the increasingly violent supernatural activity, she discovered Ezekiel's secret. Hidden behind a false wall was a collection of Native American artifacts, bones, and ceremonial objects that he had been hoarding since the beginning of construction. Among them were human skulls, some still bearing traces of the sacred red ochre used in burial ceremonies. But the most disturbing discovery was a journal in Ezekiel's handwriting detailing his systematic desecration of the burial grounds. Page after page described how he had ordered the destruction of graves, the grinding of bones into mortar, and the incorporation of sacred objects into the very structure of the house. The journal also revealed that Ezekiel had been experiencing supernatural encounters from the very beginning, but instead of being frightened, he had been documenting them as if he were conducting some kind of twisted experiment. The final entry in the journal, dated just days before Margaret's discovery, was the most chilling of all. In it, Ezekiel wrote about a vision he had experienced in which the spirits of the desecrated dead had spoken to him directly. They had told him that his family would pay for his crimes, not just in this life, but for generations to come. Every Caldwell descendant would be marked, and the family line would end in madness and death. Margaret knew she had to act. In the dead of night, she gathered her children and what few belongings she could carry, and fled the mansion. She left behind a letter for Ezekiel explaining what she had discovered and begging him to come to his senses and leave the cursed house. But Ezekiel never read the letter. By the time the townspeople discovered Margaret's absence, he had already begun his final descent into madness. For 3 weeks, Ezekiel lived alone in the mansion, and the supernatural activity reached levels that had never been experienced before. Neighbors reported seeing lights dancing in the windows at all hours, and the sound of drums and chanting could be heard from miles away. Some brave souls attempted to check on Ezekiel, but they were driven away by an oppressive feeling of dread that seemed to emanate from the house itself. On a cold February morning in 1837, Sheriff William Barnes finally forced his way into the mansion to conduct a welfare check. What he found inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ezekiel was discovered in the main hall, sitting in a chair surrounded by candles, his eyes wide open, but clearly dead. His body showed no signs of violence, but his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. But the most disturbing aspect of the scene was what surrounded him. The walls of the main hall were covered in symbols and writings that appeared to be Native American in origin. Though no living tribal member could translate them, the symbols seemed to have been carved into the wood and stone with fingernails, and they were stained with what appeared to be blood. In the center of the room, a circle had been drawn on the floor using what was later determined to be a mixture of ash and ground bone. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as heart failure brought on by extreme terror. But those who saw the body whispered that Ezekiel had been literally frightened to death by something so horrible that his mind couldn't process it. The funeral was a small affair attended only by a handful of townspeople who felt obligated to show their respects. Margaret and the children did not attend. With Ezekiel's death, the town of Millbrook hoped that the nightmare was finally over. The mansion was sealed and left to decay. And for several years, it seemed as though the supernatural activity had ended. But the Caldwell family's ordeal was far from finished. The curse that had been laid upon them was just beginning to manifest its true power. Margaret had taken the children to live with her sister in Philadelphia, hoping that distance would protect them from whatever evil had consumed their father. For a time, it seemed as though they might be able to build a normal life. Thomas showed signs of recovering from his traumatic early childhood, and baby Sarah, despite her physical challenges, was developing into a bright and affectionate child. But the peace was short-lived. On Thomas's 8th birthday in 1840, the supernatural phenomena began again. It started with nightmares, just as it had with his father. Thomas would wake screaming, claiming that he could see the buried people standing around his bed. He would draw pictures of men and women in traditional Native American dress, always depicting them as angry or sad, always showing them emerging from the ground. Margaret tried to dismiss these episodes as childhood trauma, but she couldn't ignore the physical evidence that began to appear. Thomas would wake up with scratches on his arms and legs, marks that looked like claw marks, but couldn't be explained by anything in his environment. Objects in the house would move on their own, and the temperature would drop suddenly whenever Thomas was experiencing one of his episodes. The family's troubles intensified when Sarah began to display unusual abilities. Despite being born with severe physical disabilities, she seemed to possess an uncanny knowledge of things she had never been taught. She would speak about events that had happened at the mansion before she was born, describing details that only someone who had been there could know. She would also predict future events with disturbing accuracy, always focusing on tragedies and deaths. By 1842, it became clear that the curse was not limited to the mansion itself. The Caldwell family had been marked, and no amount of distance could save them from the supernatural forces that had been set in motion by Ezekiel's crimes. Margaret made the difficult decision to return to Millbrook with her children, hoping that confronting the source of the curse might somehow break it. The mansion had been abandoned for 5 years, and nature had begun to reclaim it. Vines covered the walls, windows were broken, and the once grand entrance was choked with weeds. But as the family approached the house, they could feel the same oppressive presence that had driven them away years earlier. If anything, it had grown stronger in their absence. Margaret's plan was to perform some kind of ritual to appease the spirits, to acknowledge the wrongs that had been committed and ask for forgiveness. She had spent years researching Native American spiritual practices, and she believed that she could find a way to make amends for her husband's actions. But she underestimated the depth of the anger and hatred that had been building for decades. The moment the family entered the mansion, the supernatural activity exploded with unprecedented violence. Doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. The temperature plummeted and ice began to form on the walls. The sound of drums and chanting filled the air so loud that it was physically painful. But most terrifying of all were the apparitions that began to manifest. The spirits of the desecrated dead appeared throughout the house, no longer content to remain in the shadows. They were visible to all 3 family members, and their rage was palpable. Margaret found herself face to face with what appeared to be a Native American chief, his face painted with war paint, his eyes burning with supernatural fire. He spoke to her in perfect English, his voice like the sound of wind through a graveyard. "You have returned to the place of your shame," he said. "Your husband defiled our sacred ground, scattered our bones, and built his monument to greet upon our graves. The debt must be paid, and it will be paid in blood." Margaret tried to explain that she had come to make amends, that she understood the terrible wrong that had been done. But the chief shook his head, his expression implacable. "The time for amends has passed," he said. "The curse has been set in motion and it cannot be stopped. Your family line will end in madness and death just as your husband's arrogance began in madness and death. This is the price of desecration." What happened next in the mansion has never been fully documented as no outside witnesses survived to tell the tale. But based on evidence found later and on the few coherent accounts that Margaret managed to write before her own death, it appears that the family was subjected to a night of supernatural terror that pushed them all beyond the breaking point. Thomas, now 12 years old, was the first to succumb. According to Margaret's account, he began to convulse violently, speaking in Native American languages and describing visions of being buried alive. His physical appearance began to change, his skin taking on a grayish pallor, and his eyes becoming clouded like those of the dead. He died at dawn, his body found in the same position as his father had been, sitting upright with his eyes wide open in terror. Sarah lasted longer, but her suffering was perhaps even more terrible. Her physical disabilities had always been severe, but on that night in the mansion, they seemed to worsen exponentially. She complained of feeling as though her bones were being crushed, and she began to speak in the voices of the dead, describing their burial practices and their anger at being disturbed. She died 3 days later, her body found in the basement near the hidden collection of desecrated artifacts. Margaret was the last to die, and her death was the most mysterious of all. She was found in the main hall in the same chair where Ezekiel had died, but her body showed signs of having been there for weeks rather than days. The coroner estimated that she had been dead for at least a month, despite the fact that neighbors had seen her entering the house only a week earlier. Her final journal entry, written in handwriting that became increasingly erratic, described visions of being taken back in time to witness the original desecration of the burial grounds. "I can see them," she wrote. "The families mourning their dead, the ceremonies being performed, the sacred objects being placed with love and reverence, and then I see him, my husband, like a demon among the graves, ordering the destruction of everything holy. I understand now why we must all pay. Some sins are too great for forgiveness." With Margaret's death, the direct line of the Caldwell family seemed to be extinguished. The mansion was once again sealed, and the townspeople hoped that the curse had finally run its course. But they were wrong. The Caldwell family tree had other branches, and the supernatural forces that had been unleashed were not so easily satisfied. Ezekiel's brother, Samuel Caldwell, had been living in Boston since the 1830s, working as a merchant, and completely unaware of the supernatural events that had destroyed his brother's family. He had maintained minimal contact with Ezekiel over the years, and he had never visited the mansion or been told about the circumstances of its construction. When news of the family's deaths reached him, he assumed that they had succumbed to some kind of disease or accident. Samuel inherited the mansion and the surrounding property, and in 1843, he decided to move his own family to Pennsylvania to take advantage of what he saw as a valuable real estate opportunity. He brought with him his wife Rebecca and their 3 children, James, Mary, and little Elizabeth. Like his brother before him, Samuel was ambitious and saw the mansion as a symbol of the family's rising status. But Samuel's branch of the family tree was not immune to the curse that had been laid upon the Caldwell name. Within days of moving into the mansion, the supernatural phenomena began again. The pattern was eerily similar to what had been experienced by Ezekiel's family, but with some disturbing new developments. The spirits seemed to be more organized this time, as if they had learned from their previous encounters with the living. Instead of random manifestations of anger and rage, the supernatural activity seemed to follow a deliberate pattern, as if the dead were carrying out some kind of systematic campaign against the new occupants. James, the oldest of Samuel's children at age 15, began to experience what could only be described as possession. He would disappear for hours at a time, only to be found in the basement, digging frantically with his bare hands. When questioned about his activities, he would claim that he was helping them go home. But he seemed to have no memory of what he had been doing. Each time he was found, he would be covered in dirt and his fingernails would be torn and bleeding. Mary, aged 12, developed an obsession with fire. She would light candles and stare into the flames for hours, claiming that she could see faces in the dancing light. Her behavior became increasingly erratic, and she began to speak about the burned ones, referring to spirits who had been cremated according to traditional practices, but whose ashes had been scattered and desecrated along with the buried remains. Little Elizabeth, only 8 years old, was perhaps the most disturbing case of all. She began to age rapidly, her hair turning gray and her skin developing wrinkles and age spots. She would speak in the voice of an elderly Native American woman, describing life in the village that had once existed on the land where the mansion now stood. She would tell stories of the seasonal ceremonies, the coming-of-age rituals, and the sacred relationship between the living and the dead. Samuel and Rebecca tried desperately to find a rational explanation for their children's behavior. They consulted doctors, priests, and even a traveling spiritualist who claimed to specialize in supernatural phenomena. But nothing they tried had any effect on the supernatural activity that was consuming their family. The spiritualist, a woman named Madame Zelda, who had gained some notoriety in the region for her claimed ability to communicate with the dead, spent 3 nights in the mansion attempting to understand the nature of the haunting. Her experience there was documented in a series of letters she wrote to her sister, letters that were discovered years later among her personal effects. According to Madame Zelda's account, the mansion was home to dozens of spirits, all of them Native Americans who had been buried on the property before its desecration. But these were not ordinary ghosts. They were the spirits of people who had been denied their proper passage to the afterlife because their remains had been disturbed and scattered. They were trapped in a state of supernatural limbo, unable to rest and growing more angry and powerful with each passing year. The spiritualist also claimed to have made contact with the spirit of Ezekiel Caldwell himself, who appeared to her as a tormented soul, begging for forgiveness, but unable to find peace. According to her account, Ezekiel's spirit was being punished by the Native American spirits, forced to witness the suffering of his descendants as payment for his crimes. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation in Madame Zelda's letters was her description of what she called the Great Summoning. She claimed that the Native American spirits were not just seeking revenge against the Caldwell family. They were actively working to gather more supernatural allies to their cause. The mansion had become a focal point for spiritual energy, attracting the ghosts of other Native Americans who had died throughout the region, all of them united in their anger at the systematic destruction of their sacred sites. Madame Zelda's investigation ended abruptly on her 3rd night in the mansion when she was found unconscious in the main hall, her hair turned completely white and her eyes wide with terror. She recovered consciousness but refused to discuss what she had experienced, saying only that the situation was beyond human comprehension and that the Caldwell family should abandon the mansion immediately. But Samuel, like his brother before him, was unwilling to give up his investment in the property. He had spent his life savings to move the family to Pennsylvania, and he couldn't afford to start over somewhere else. Instead, he decided to fight back against the supernatural forces that were terrorizing his family. Samuel's approach was more aggressive than his brother's had been. Instead of trying to ignore the supernatural activity, he began to actively confront it. He would spend nights in the basement shouting challenges at the spirits and demanding that they leave his family alone. He brought in a local pastor to perform multiple exorcisms, and he even attempted to burn down portions of the mansion that seemed to be particularly active supernatural hotspots. These efforts only served to enrage the spirits further. The supernatural activity escalated to levels that had never been experienced before, even during the worst of Ezekiel's time in the mansion. The house would shake violently as if it were being torn apart by invisible hands. The temperature would fluctuate wildly, sometimes dropping below freezing, and other times becoming so hot that the family would be forced to flee certain rooms. But the most terrifying development was the appearance of what Samuel described in his journal as the Shadow Army. These were not individual spirits, but rather a mass of dark shapes that would move through the house like a living thing. They would engulf furniture, walls, and even family members, leaving behind a feeling of overwhelming dread and despair. The end came for Samuel's family in the spring of 1844. James, who had been growing increasingly unstable, disappeared one night during a particularly violent supernatural episode. He was found a week later in the woods behind the mansion, his body partially buried in a shallow grave that appeared to have been dug by hand. The coroner's report noted that he had been buried alive, but there was no evidence of struggle or any indication of who might have been responsible. Mary's death followed shortly after. She was found in her bedroom, surrounded by dozens of candles that had burned down to stubs. Her body showed no signs of violence, but her skin was severely burned, as if she had been exposed to intense heat for an extended period of time. The strangest aspect of her death was that the candles appeared to have been burning for days, but the room showed no other signs of fire damage. Elizabeth's fate was perhaps the most tragic of all. Her rapid aging had accelerated to the point where she appeared to be an elderly woman despite being only 8 years old. She would spend hours sitting in the parlor, rocking back and forth and speaking in Native American languages. She died peacefully in her sleep, but when her body was found, it had the appearance of someone who had died of old age rather than a child. Rebecca, driven to the edge of madness by the loss of her children, attempted to burn down the mansion with herself inside, but the fire would not catch despite her repeated attempts to ignite the building. She was found dead in the main hall, sitting in the same chair where Ezekiel and Margaret had died before her, her body showing no signs of the burns that should have resulted from her suicide attempt. Samuel was the last to die, and his death was the most violent yet. He was found in the basement, his body showing signs of having been beaten and tortured, but there were no human perpetrators. The wounds appeared to have been inflicted by supernatural forces. His final journal entry, written in his own blood, consisted of a single sentence repeated over and over: "They will never let us go." With the death of Samuel's family, the town of Millbrook had finally had enough. The mansion was not just sealed this time. It was officially condemned, and the surrounding property was declared off limits to the public. The local authorities posted armed guards around the perimeter, and anyone caught trespassing would be arrested and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But even these measures could not contain the supernatural forces that had been unleashed. The curse of the Caldwell family began to spread beyond the mansion itself, affecting anyone who had even remote connections to the family name. Distant relatives who had never even heard of the mansion began to experience supernatural phenomena. Business partners who had dealt with the Caldwells found themselves plagued by unexplained accidents and mysterious deaths. The curse seemed to have a particular interest in those who shared the Caldwell bloodline, no matter how distant the connection. Cousins, in-laws, and even adopted family members found themselves experiencing the same kinds of supernatural harassment that had driven the direct descendants to madness and death. One such case was that of Jonathan Caldwell, a third cousin who lived in New York and worked as a banker. He had never met Ezekiel or Samuel, and he had no knowledge of the mansion or its history. But in 1845, he began to experience nightmares that were strikingly similar to those that had plagued other members of the family. He would dream of being buried alive, of walking through dark forests pursued by angry spirits, and of standing in a grand house while invisible voices cursed his very existence. Jonathan's case was particularly well documented because he was an educated man who kept detailed records of his experiences. His journal, which was discovered after his death, provides a chilling account of how the supernatural harassment escalated over time. It began with minor incidents, objects moving on their own, strange sounds in the night, and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. But as the weeks passed, the activity became more aggressive. Jonathan would wake up to find his bedroom rearranged, his personal belongings scattered, and messages written on his mirrors in what appeared to be blood. The messages were always the same: "The debt must be paid, and your family will answer for the desecration." Jonathan initially dismissed these incidents as pranks or as symptoms of stress from his demanding job. But when he began to see the apparitions, he could no longer deny that something supernatural was happening. The spirits that appeared to Jonathan were the same ones that had tormented his relatives in Pennsylvania. They were Native Americans in traditional dress, their faces painted with war paint, their eyes burning with supernatural fire. They would appear in his bedroom, his office, and even on busy city streets, always staring at him with expressions of implacable rage. Jonathan's attempts to understand what was happening to him led him to investigate his family history, and eventually he discovered the truth about the mansion and the curse that had been laid upon his bloodline. Armed with this knowledge, he made the fateful decision to travel to Pennsylvania to confront the source of his supernatural harassment. His journey to Millbrook was fraught with ominous signs. His train was delayed multiple times due to unexplained mechanical failures. He was involved in a carriage accident that should have killed him, but left him mysteriously unharmed. And throughout the journey, he was plagued by visions of the mansion, seeing it as it had been during the height of the supernatural activity. When Jonathan finally arrived in Millbrook, he found a town that was still traumatized by the events of the previous decade. The locals were reluctant to discuss the Caldwell family, and many refused to speak about the mansion at all. But Jonathan was determined to find answers, and he eventually managed to locate some of the people who had been involved in the investigation of the family's deaths. Sheriff Barnes, who had discovered Ezekiel's body years earlier, was still alive, but had been deeply affected by his experiences. He agreed to meet with Jonathan, but only after extracting a promise that the conversation would remain confidential. According to Barnes, the supernatural activity had not been contained to the mansion. It had spread throughout the area, affecting anyone who had been involved in the investigation. Several of the men who had helped to seal the mansion had died under mysterious circumstances, and others had been driven insane by supernatural harassment that mirrored what the Caldwell family had experienced. Barnes himself had been plagued by nightmares and visions, and he had developed a nervous condition that made it difficult for him to function in his official capacity. Despite these warnings, Jonathan was determined to visit the mansion and confront the spirits that were tormenting him. He hired a local guide, a man named William Murphy, who claimed to know the area well, and together they set out for Prospect Hill on a cold autumn morning in 1845. The mansion had continued to decay during the years since it was sealed. The roof had partially collapsed, and the walls were covered with vines and moss. But as Jonathan approached the building, he could feel the same oppressive presence that had been described by previous visitors. The air around the mansion seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy, and the temperature dropped noticeably as they drew closer. Murphy, who had initially been skeptical of Jonathan's claims about supernatural activity, became increasingly nervous as they approached the mansion. He reported feeling watched by unseen eyes, and he claimed to hear the sound of drums and chanting coming from inside the building. When they reached the front door, he refused to go any further, saying that he would wait for Jonathan outside. Jonathan entered the mansion alone, and what he found inside exceeded his worst fears. The building was not just haunted, it was alive with supernatural energy. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with an otherworldly heartbeat, and the air was thick with the presence of the dead. As he walked through the rooms, he could see the spirits of the Native Americans who had been buried on the property, their forms more solid and menacing than they had ever appeared to him before. But it was in the basement that Jonathan made the most disturbing discovery. The hidden collection of desecrated artifacts was still there, but it had grown significantly since Margaret's time. The spirits had been gathering more items, bringing together sacred objects from throughout the region in what appeared to be preparation for some kind of final ceremony. At the center of the collection was a circle of human skulls arranged in a pattern that seemed to have deep spiritual significance. Within the circle were the bones of what appeared to be dozens of individuals, all of them arranged with ceremonial precision. And standing in the center of the circle was the spirit of a Native American chief, the same one who had appeared to Margaret years earlier. The chief spoke to Jonathan in the same perfect English that Margaret had described, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of anger and betrayal. "You have come to the place of your family's shame," he said. "You seek to understand why your bloodline has been cursed, why your relatives have died in madness and terror. The answer lies before you, in the bones of our ancestors, that your family scattered like dust in the wind." Jonathan tried to explain that he had not been responsible for the desecration, that he had not even known about it until recently. But the chief was unmoved by his pleas. "The sins of the fathers are visited upon the children," the chief replied. "Your family took our sacred places and built monuments to greet upon our graves. The debt must be paid, and it will be paid in blood and suffering until the last of your line has been consumed by the darkness that your ancestor invited into this world." The chief then revealed the true scope of the curse that had been laid upon the Caldwell family. It was not just a matter of supernatural harassment. It was a systematic campaign to erase the Caldwell name from existence entirely. Every member of the family, no matter how distant their connection, would be hunted down by the spirits of the desecrated dead until the bloodline was completely extinguished. But the chief also revealed something even more terrifying. The curse was not limited to the Caldwell family. Anyone who had benefited from the desecration, anyone who had lived on the land or profited from its development, would also be held accountable. The entire town of Millbrook was built on sacred ground, and the spirits were preparing to extend their vengeance to encompass everyone who had participated in the systematic destruction of their culture. Jonathan listened to this revelation with growing horror, understanding that he was not just witnessing the supernatural consequences of his family's actions, but that he was seeing the beginning of something much larger and more devastating. The curse was evolving, growing stronger with each passing year, and it would not be satisfied until every trace of the colonial settlement had been swept away. The chief's final words to Jonathan were both a warning and a prophecy. "Your family was the first to defile our sacred places, but you will not be the last to pay the price. The darkness that your ancestor unleashed will spread until it consumes all who have built their lives upon our bones. This is the price of desecration, and it will be paid in full." With those words, the spirits in the basement began to move, surrounding Jonathan with an overwhelming presence of rage and hatred. He felt his sanity slipping away as the voices of the dead filled his mind, all of them speaking at once, all of them demanding justice for the wrongs that had been done to them. Jonathan's guide, William Murphy, found him 3 days later sitting in the main hall of the mansion in the same chair where so many members of the Caldwell family had died before him. Jonathan was alive, but his mind was completely gone. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, occasionally muttering in what sounded like Native American languages. He would draw pictures of burial ceremonies and sacred rituals, despite having no knowledge of such things. Murphy brought Jonathan back to town, but it was clear that he would never recover. He was placed in the care of a local doctor, but his condition only worsened with time. He would spend his days talking to invisible companions, describing visions of the mansion and the spirits that dwelt there. He died 6 months later, his body found in the same position as all the other Caldwell family members, sitting upright with his eyes wide open in terror. But Jonathan's death was not the end of the curse's reach. In the months that followed, other distant relatives began to experience supernatural phenomena. A cousin in Boston reported seeing Native American spirits in her home. A nephew in Philadelphia began to have nightmares about being buried alive. An adopted family member in Virginia found his house plagued by the sound of drums and chanting. The pattern was always the same: the supernatural harassment would begin with minor incidents, escalate to full manifestations, and eventually drive the victim to madness and death. No amount of distance seemed to provide protection, and no amount of prayer or spiritual intervention could break the curse. As word of these incidents spread, historians and supernatural investigators began to take notice. The Caldwell Curse, as it came to be known, was unprecedented in its scope and persistence. Unlike other reported hauntings, which were typically limited to specific locations or tied to particular objects, this curse seemed to have a life of its own, actively seeking out its victims and adapting its methods to overcome any defenses they might employ. One of the most thorough investigations of the curse was conducted by Dr. Cornelius Whitman, a professor of anthropology at Harvard University, who had made a career of studying Native American spiritual practices. Dr. Whitman became interested in the Caldwell case after reading newspaper accounts of the mysterious deaths that had been plaguing the family, and he decided to conduct his own research into the matter. Dr. Whitman's investigation, which took place over several months in 1847, was remarkable for its thoroughness and scientific approach. He interviewed dozens of witnesses, examined the physical evidence at the mansion, and consulted with surviving members of the local Native American tribes who had knowledge of the spiritual practices that had been violated by Ezekiel Caldwell's actions. What Dr. Whitman discovered was that the land where the mansion stood had been sacred to the local tribes for centuries. It was not just a burial ground, it was a place where the most important spiritual ceremonies were conducted, where tribal leaders were trained in the sacred arts, and where the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds was believed to be strongest. The desecration of such a place was considered by the tribes to be one of the most serious spiritual crimes imaginable. According to Dr. Whitman's sources, the violation of sacred burial grounds was believed to trap the spirits of the dead in a state of supernatural limbo, unable to journey to the afterlife and growing more powerful and angry with each passing year. But what made the Caldwell case particularly significant was the scale of the desecration. Ezekiel had not just disturbed a few graves, he had systematically destroyed dozens of burial sites, scattered the bones of hundreds of individuals, and incorporated their remains into the very structure of his mansion. The spiritual energy that had been released by these actions was unprecedented, and it had created what Dr. Whitman described as a supernatural vortex that was drawing in spiritual energy from across the region. Dr. Whitman's most disturbing discovery was that the curse was not static. It was evolving and growing stronger with time. The spirits that had been unleashed by the desecration were not just seeking revenge against the Caldwell family, they were actively working to gather more supernatural allies and to expand their influence throughout the area. The professor's final report, published in the Journal of American Folklore in 1848, concluded that the Caldwell Curse represented a new type of supernatural phenomenon, one that combined elements of traditional Native American spiritual practices with the unique circumstances of colonial settlement and cultural destruction. He predicted that the curse would continue to grow in power and scope until it encompassed the entire region, and he recommended that the mansion and the surrounding area be permanently evacuated and declared off-limits to human habitation. But Dr. Whitman's warnings were largely ignored by the local authorities, who were more concerned with the economic impact of his recommendations than with the supernatural threats he described. The town of Millbrook had grown and prospered since the 1830s, and the residents were reluctant to abandon their homes and businesses based on what many considered to be superstitious nonsense. This skepticism would prove to be a fatal mistake. In 1849, the curse began to expand beyond the Caldwell family, affecting anyone who had any connection to the mansion or the land on which it stood. The first victims were the workers who had been involved in the original construction, many of whom had settled in the area and started families of their own. The supernatural harassment that these families experienced was similar to what the Caldwells had endured, but with some disturbing variations. The spirits seemed to be more organized and purposeful in their attacks, as if they had learned from their previous encounters with the living. They would target specific individuals within each family, focusing on those who had been most directly involved in the desecration of the burial grounds. One of the most tragic cases was that of Patrick O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who had worked as a laborer during the construction of the mansion. O'Brien had been one of the workers who had been ordered to grind up the bones and mix them with mortar, a task that had troubled him greatly at the time, but which he had been forced to complete in order to feed his family. O'Brien had settled in Millbrook after the construction was completed, and he had built a successful career as a stonemason. He had married a local woman, raised 5 children, and was considered to be one of the most respected members of the community. But in 1849, his peaceful life was shattered when the supernatural harassment began. It started with nightmares, just as it had with the Caldwell family members. O'Brien would dream of being pursued through dark forests by angry spirits, and he would wake up screaming in Native American languages that he didn't understand. His wife Mary initially dismissed these episodes as the result of stress from his demanding work, but she became increasingly concerned as the nightmares grew more frequent and more violent. Soon, the supernatural activity began to manifest in the physical world. Tools would disappear from O'Brien's workshop, only to be found arranged in patterns that seemed to have spiritual significance. The temperature in his house would drop suddenly and inexplicably, and the family would hear the sound of drums and chanting coming from empty rooms. But the most disturbing development was the change in O'Brien's behavior. He became obsessed with the idea that he needed to return to the mansion to fix what he had broken. He would spend hours talking about the Native American spirits, describing them as if he knew them personally and expressing deep remorse for his role in the desecration of their burial grounds. O'Brien's family tried to prevent him from visiting the mansion, but he would sneak away at night, drawn by a compulsion that he couldn't resist. Each time he returned from these nocturnal visits, he would be more disturbed and more disconnected from reality. He would speak in Native American languages, draw pictures of burial ceremonies, and describe visions of the mansion as it had been during the height of the supernatural activity. The end came for O'Brien on a cold night in November 1849. He disappeared from his home during a violent thunderstorm, and his body was found the next morning in the ruins of the mansion, sitting in the same chair where so many had died before him. But unlike the previous victims, O'Brien's death showed signs of violence. His body was covered in wounds that appeared to have been inflicted by multiple attackers, but there was no evidence of any human perpetrators. O'Brien's death sent shock waves through the community of Millbrook. He had been a popular and respected member of the town, and his gruesome fate made it clear that the supernatural forces that had been unleashed were not limited to the Caldwell family. Anyone who had been involved in the construction of the mansion, no matter how indirectly, was now a potential target. The panic that followed O'Brien's death led to a mass exodus from Millbrook. Families who had lived in the area for generations packed up their belongings and moved away, unwilling to risk becoming the next victims of the curse. Businesses closed, property values plummeted, and the once thriving community began to wither and die. But for those who remained, the supernatural harassment continued to escalate. The spirits seemed to be emboldened by their success in driving away so many of the town's people, and they began to target anyone who had even the most tenuous connection to the mansion or its construction. The local blacksmith, who had forged the nails used in the mansion's construction, began to experience supernatural phenomena in his workshop. His tools would rearrange themselves overnight, and he would find mysterious symbols carved into his workbench. The baker, who had provided food for the construction workers, found his ovens plagued by strange fires that would burn cold instead of hot. The local pastor, who had been called upon to bless the mansion's construction, began to have visions of Native American spirits standing in his church, their faces painted with war paint and their eyes burning with supernatural fire. As the curse continued to spread, it became clear that the spirits were not just seeking revenge against individuals, they were working to reclaim the entire area for their own purposes. The mansion itself had become a focal point for supernatural energy, drawing in spirits from across the region and serving as a base of operations for their campaign against the living. Reports began to surface of travelers who had gotten lost in the woods around the mansion, only to find themselves surrounded by the ghosts of Native Americans who would lead them deeper into the forest and leave them to die of exposure. Hunters reported seeing entire villages of spirits in the woods, complete with lodges, fires, and ceremonial gatherings that would vanish the moment they were observed directly. The local authorities, faced with a situation that was clearly beyond their ability to handle, finally reached out to the federal government for assistance. But the officials who were sent to investigate the situation were skeptical of the supernatural claims and focused instead on finding rational explanations for the mysterious deaths and disappearances. This skepticism proved to be a fatal mistake. The federal investigators who visited the mansion in 1850 were unprepared for the level of supernatural activity they encountered. 3 of the 4-man team died under mysterious circumstances, and the 4th, a man named Captain Theodore Harrison, was found wandering the woods in a state of complete madness, babbling about armies of the dead and the Great Gathering. Captain Harrison's report, written after he had partially recovered his sanity, described supernatural phenomena that exceeded anything that had been previously documented. According to his account, the mansion was no longer just haunted, it had become a portal between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Spirits were pouring through this portal in ever-increasing numbers, and they were being organized into a supernatural army that was preparing for a final assault on the living world. The captain's report was classified by the federal government and hidden away in the archives, but copies were leaked to the press, and the story of the Caldwell Curse became a national sensation. Newspapers across the country published sensationalized accounts of the supernatural events in Millbrook, and the town became a destination for thrill-seekers and supernatural investigators. But these visitors soon discovered that the curse was not just a tourist attraction, it was a very real and very dangerous phenomenon. Several prominent investigators died under mysterious circumstances, and others were driven insane by their encounters with the supernatural forces that had been unleashed. One of the most notable cases was that of Professor Edgar Montague, a well-known spiritualist from New York who had claimed to have the ability to communicate with and control supernatural entities. Professor Montague arrived in Millbrook in 1851 with great fanfare, promising to solve the mystery of the Caldwell Curse and put the spirits to rest once and for all. Montague's investigation was conducted with great publicity, and he held nightly seances in the mansion that were attended by reporters and curiosity seekers from across the region. For the first few nights, the seances seemed to be successful, with Montague claiming to have made contact with the spirits and to have begun the process of negotiating their departure from the physical world. But on the 4th night, something went terribly wrong. According to witnesses, Montague began to convulse violently during the seance, speaking in Native American languages and describing visions of mass graves and systematic desecration. His physical appearance began to change, his skin taking on a grayish pallor and his eyes becoming clouded like those of the dead. The seance participants fled in terror, but Montague remained in the mansion, apparently unable or unwilling to leave. He was found the next morning in the basement, sitting in the circle of skulls that had been arranged by the spirits. His body showed signs of having been there for weeks, despite the fact that he had been seen alive just hours earlier. Montague's death marked a turning point in the public perception of the Caldwell Curse. What had previously been seen as a fascinating supernatural mystery was now recognized as a genuine threat to public safety. The federal government finally took decisive action, declaring the mansion and the surrounding area to be a federal disaster zone and establishing a military perimeter around the property. But even these measures were not enough to contain the supernatural forces that had been unleashed. The spirits seemed to be able to cross the military perimeter at will, and they began to target the soldiers who had been stationed there to keep people away from the mansion. The military personnel who were assigned to the Millbrook detail began to experience the same kinds of supernatural harassment that had plagued the Caldwell family and the other victims of the curse. They would hear the sound of drums and chanting coming from the mansion, see apparitions of Native American warriors in the woods, and wake up to find their equipment rearranged or their tents surrounded by mysterious symbols. Several soldiers died under mysterious circumstances, and others were driven insane by their encounters with the supernatural forces. The military command, faced with a situation that was clearly beyond their ability to handle, finally made the decision to abandon the area entirely. In 1852, the federal government issued an executive order permanently evacuating the town of Millbrook and declaring the entire area to be off-limits to civilian settlement. The few remaining residents were relocated to other communities, and the town was left to be reclaimed by the wilderness. But the abandonment of Millbrook did not end the curse. It only changed its focus. The spirits, deprived of their primary targets, began to expand their influence even further, seeking out anyone who had any connection to the Caldwell family or to the original desecration of the burial grounds. The curse began to manifest in distant cities and towns, affecting people who had never even heard of Millbrook or the Caldwell family. Genealogists who had researched the Caldwell family tree began to experience supernatural phenomena. Historians who had written about the case found themselves plagued by visions of Native American spirits. Even people who had simply read newspaper accounts of the curse reported strange occurrences in their homes. The supernatural harassment that these individuals experienced was similar to what had been documented in Millbrook, but with some disturbing variations. The spirits seemed to be more subtle in their approach, working to drive their victims to madness and death through psychological manipulation rather than direct supernatural attack. One of the most well-documented cases was that of Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a historian at Columbia University, who had been researching the Caldwell Curse for a book she was writing about supernatural phenomena in American history. Dr. Hartwell had never visited Millbrook, and she had no personal connection to the Caldwell family, but she began to experience supernatural harassment shortly after she started her research. It began with minor incidents. Books would be rearranged in her office. Her research notes would disappear, and she would hear the sound of drums and chanting coming from empty rooms. But as her research progressed, the supernatural activity became more aggressive and more personal. Dr. Hartwell began to have vivid dreams about the mansion and the spirits that dwelt there. In these dreams, she would see the original desecration of the burial grounds, witnessing the systematic destruction of the sacred sites and the scattering of the bones. She would wake up with detailed knowledge of Native American spiritual practices that she had never studied, and she would find herself drawing pictures of burial ceremonies and sacred rituals. The supernatural harassment escalated when Dr. Hartwell began to write about her findings. Every time she tried to put her research into writing, she would be plagued by visions of Native American spirits who would appear in her office, their faces painted with war paint and their eyes burning with supernatural fire. They would speak to her in perfect English, warning her that she was treading on sacred ground and that she would pay the price for her intrusion into their affairs. Dr. Hartwell tried to abandon her research, but the supernatural harassment continued even after she stopped working on the book. The spirits seemed to be determined to punish her for her investigation into their affairs, and they began to target her family and friends as well. Dr. Hartwell's husband, a prominent lawyer, began to experience supernatural phenomena in his law office. Her children reported seeing Native American spirits in their bedrooms at night. Her colleagues at the university found their own research disrupted by mysterious incidents that seemed to be connected to Dr. Hartwell's work on the Caldwell Curse. The situation reached a crisis point when Dr. Hartwell's youngest daughter, a 10-year-old girl named Sarah, began to show signs of supernatural possession. The child would speak in Native American languages, describe visions of the mansion, and draw pictures of burial ceremonies with an accuracy that was impossible for someone her age. Dr. Hartwell finally made the decision to travel to Pennsylvania to confront the source of the supernatural harassment. She hoped that by visiting the site of the original desecration, she might be able to understand what the spirits wanted and find a way to appease them. Dr. Hartwell's journey to the abandoned town of Millbrook was fraught with ominous signs. Her train was delayed by mechanical failures, her hotel reservations were mysteriously cancelled, and she was plagued by visions of the mansion throughout the journey. But she was determined to see the investigation through to its conclusion, even if it meant risking her own life. The abandoned town of Millbrook was a haunting sight. The buildings had been left to decay for over a decade, and nature had begun to reclaim the area. Vines covered the walls of the houses, trees grew through the roofs, and the streets were choked with weeds and debris. But despite the physical decay, the area was alive with supernatural energy. Dr. Hartwell could feel the presence of the spirits even before she reached the mansion. The air itself seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy, and she could hear the sound of drums and chanting coming from the direction of Prospect Hill. As she made her way through the abandoned streets, she could see shadowy figures watching her from the windows of the empty houses, figures that would vanish the moment she looked directly at them. The mansion itself was in a state of advanced decay, but it was still recognizable as the grand structure that Ezekiel Caldwell had built all those years ago. The roof had partially collapsed, the walls were covered with vines and moss, and the windows were broken and boarded up. But despite its physical deterioration, the building radiated a presence that was both ancient and malevolent. Dr. Hartwell entered the mansion through a gap in the boarded-up front door, and she was immediately confronted by the same oppressive atmosphere that had driven so many previous visitors to madness and death. The air was thick with the presence of the dead, and she could feel the weight of their anger and hatred pressing down upon her. As she explored the ruins of the mansion, Dr. Hartwell began to understand the true scope of the supernatural forces that had been unleashed. The building was not just haunted, it was a nexus point for spiritual energy, a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead had been permanently breached. In the basement, she found the collection of desecrated artifacts that had been described by previous investigators. But the collection had grown significantly since the last documented visit. The spirits had been gathering sacred objects from across the region, bringing together items that had been scattered and lost over the decades since the original desecration. At the center of the collection was the circle of skulls that had been arranged by the spirits. And standing within the circle was the same Native American chief who had appeared to so many previous visitors. He spoke to Dr. Hartwell in the same perfect English that had been described by others, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of anger and betrayal. "You have come seeking knowledge," he said. "But knowledge comes with a price. Your people have taken our sacred places, scattered our bones, and built your monuments to greet upon our graves. The debt must be paid, and it will be paid in blood and suffering until the last trace of your civilization has been swept away." Dr. Hartwell tried to explain that she had come to understand and to help, that she wanted to find a way to make amends for the wrongs that had been done. But the chief was unmoved by her pleas. "The time for amends has passed," he replied. "The curse has been set in motion and it cannot be stopped. Your people will pay for the desecration of our sacred places. Not just those who committed the crimes, but all who have benefited from them. This is the price of building your civilization upon our bones." With those words, the spirits in the basement began to move, surrounding Dr. Hartwell with an overwhelming presence of rage and hatred. She felt her sanity slipping away as the voices of the dead filled her mind, all of them speaking at once, all of them demanding justice for the wrongs that had been done to them. Dr. Hartwell was found 3 days later by a search party that had been sent to look for her. She was sitting in the main hall of the mansion in the same chair where so many others had died before her. Her eyes were wide open, but her mind completely gone. She was alive, but she would never speak again, never write again, never function as a rational human being. Dr. Hartwell was taken to a private asylum where she spent the remaining years of her life in a state of complete madness. She would sit for hours staring at nothing, occasionally muttering in Native American languages that she had never studied. She would draw pictures of burial ceremonies and sacred rituals despite having no knowledge of such things. And she would describe visions of the mansion and the spirits that dwelt there. Her case became a cautionary tale for other researchers who might be tempted to investigate the Caldwell Curse. The supernatural forces that had been unleashed were not just dangerous to those who had direct connections to the original desecration, they were a threat to anyone who dared to probe too deeply into their affairs. As the years passed, the curse continued to spread, affecting people across the country and even beyond. The spirits seemed to be working systematically to erase all traces of the colonial settlement that had been built upon their sacred grounds, and they would not be satisfied until every person who had benefited from the desecration had been made to pay the price. The story of the Caldwell family became a legend, whispered in hushed tones by those who knew the truth about what had happened in Millbrook. But for most people, it remained just a story, a tale of supernatural horror that was too fantastic to be believed. But the curse was far from finished. Even now, more than a century and a half after Ezekiel Caldwell first broke ground on his mansion, the spirits continue their relentless campaign of vengeance. They seek out anyone who has any connection to the original desecration, no matter how distant or indirect that connection might be, and they are still watching, still waiting, still planning their next move in a supernatural war that has no end in sight. What the Caldwells built on, they never paid for, and the debt continues to grow with each passing year, accumulating interest in the form of blood and suffering, madness, and death. The mansion still stands on Prospect Hill, a crumbling monument to the arrogance and greed that led to one of the most horrific supernatural curses in American history. And the spirits of the desecrated dead still dwell there, gathering their strength and planning their revenge against a world that has forgotten the sacred nature of the ground upon which it was built. This is the macabre history of the Caldwells, a family that thought they could build their fortune on the bones of the dead without consequence. They were wrong, and the price of their error continues to be paid by anyone unfortunate enough to share their blood or their legacy. The curse endures, and it will continue to endure until the last debt has been settled and the last wrong has been made right. The spirits of the dead are patient, and they have all the time in the world to exact their revenge. Remember this story, and remember the lesson it teaches. Some ground is too sacred to be disturbed. Some debts are too great to be ignored, and some curses are too powerful to be broken. The Caldwell family learned this lesson too late, and they paid the ultimate price for their ignorance. But their story is not over. The curse continues, and it will continue until justice has been served and the dead have finally been allowed to rest in peace. Until then, the spirits will keep watching, keep waiting, and keep collecting the debts that are owed to them. This has been the Ghastly Journal, and I hope you'll join me next time as we explore another dark chapter in the hidden history of America. Until then, remember to respect the sacred places of those who came before us, and never forget that some debts can never be escaped, not even by death itself.